everybody. My name is Danielle Morales. I am the clinical co-director of the Bylund Clinic and a licensed educational psychologist. And I'm very excited to have Anya here today. So Anya, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Anya Ashouri, and I'm a licensed speech and language pathologist, and also an assistive technology and AAC specialist.
And that's an area that is parallel to a lot of the work that we do, with psychoeducational and academic evaluations at the Bylund Clinic, but obviously a whole area of expertise in and of itself. So we're so excited to have you today and learn more about this area of specialty. So before we get into assistive technology itself, can you tell us a little bit about your professional background? So what your current roles are? I know you wear a couple different hats, and then how you came to work in assistive tech.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So my professional background, I have a master's in science and communicative disorders. After I finished graduate school, I worked in a private practice briefly, and then I've spent most of my career in schools. So I've worked both in public education, and then I also had a stint in a non-public setting for students with autism who had significant behavioral challenges. I also worked in a college setting. So I worked in the Disability Resource Center as assistive technology faculty. And I currently teach a course at St. Mary's College in assistive technology for students getting their master's in special education. And also there's some undergrads that are getting their degree in special education. And then I also, on a personal level, my mother had an aggressive autoimmune disease. She had rheumatoid arthritis, and she had that my whole life. And that significantly impacted and shaped kind of where I am today and how I lead and working with families and students. And I just saw, like, over time, it impacted her mobility and ability to do much at all independently. And so, like, two things. It instilled an empathy in me for others that are different and they're experiencing the world differently than us. And just seeing sometimes the societal barriers that are in place for people with disabilities. And so I think our conversation today is really like building bridges and not barriers. And then also from her, I saw how assistive technology could support her. So she loved to write, and she was an excellent writer and loved to write to her family and in Germany, because she lived here and they were there. And she was unable to do that over time because of her mobility challenges and fine motor. And so she used voice typing on her iPad and was able to construct emails. And so I just saw how that tool allowed her the freedom and independence that she lost through her challenges with her disease. So yeah, that's a kind of personal and professional background. And I just wanted to note today that everything that I'm talking about is going to be in general terms about assistive technology. And so I'm not going to provide individual recommendations or guidance on how families or IEP teams should navigate. But so that's your IEP team decisions if you do have a child in special education.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for that grounding and reminder that, it's also informational purposes, right? Only, and we do speak more in generalities. But thank you for going through your background. So, it sounds like you have experience at multiple different intersections of this world, right? Like working in the clinical setting, the educational setting, the public setting. And then, as a lot of us do, have that lived experience, with family or ourselves with neurodiversity or disability that kind of brought us to this work and really provides that grounding lived experience. So thanks for talking through, your journey a little bit. So I think to start off, assistive technology is a broad term. So how would you define assistive technology, or AT, in plain language? And I think let's just start there. What is it?
Okay. So there's a real fancy term, and I'm going to kind of pull this from the IDEA definition of assistive technology. So according to, IDEA, assistive technology means any item, piece of equipment, or product system, which can be modified or customized, that is used, and these are important, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child or individual with disabilities. So I'm going to unpack that really quick. So I see it as a bridge. So I think about the individual themselves, so whether child or adult that we're talking about. And then I think about on the other end, like, what do they need to be able to do? So whether that's communication, whether that's writing, whether that's reading. And then like, what kind of tools can we think about that can bridge that gap to get them to those, to be able to do those tasks or those skills. And it is an umbrella term. So I am a speech and language pathologist. So assistive technologies is a big umbrella term. AAC, which stands for augmentative alternative communication, falls under the umbrella of assistive technology. But really only speech and language pathologists are doing AAC evaluations. Either independently or closely with their SLP, with the speech and language pathologist. And then within the umbrella is also assistive technology for everything else. So that can be, whether that is executive functioning, reading, writing, vision, hearing, so anything else. And that can be done by anybody qualified to be an assistive technology specialist. So it doesn't have to be a SLP. So sometimes SLPs do both roles. Sometimes there's an individual like a physical therapist or occupational therapist that also just does assistive technology. So it is a big umbrella term. So I'll kind of like move between using both, like explaining like AAC and then assistive technology as we get deeper into it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So there's different nuances and subspecialties under that AT umbrella, and you're zooming in on the AAC component today as a speech and language pathologist.
And I'll touch on the AT. Yeah, okay. Because I have my certificate in that. So we'll kind of toggle between both. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I think with that in mind, like with that ironed out, so who typically benefits from AT across ages and learning profiles?
Yeah. So assistive technology can benefit individuals like across a lifespan. So you can think from early childhood all the way through adulthood, and aging parents. And interestingly, like all of us at some point, like either use assistive technology or will use assistive technology. So we don't think about this, but like glasses are a form of assist, like prescription lenses are. And without them, I'm unable to, see far. And so that would impact my ability to navigate my world. So across the lifespan, and we think about different aspects of why we might need a tool. So children through adulthood benefits from assistive technology who struggle with communication. So maybe they either don't have the ability to communicate because of, the motor speech or, muscles in their voice and speech mechanism. Or maybe they're not making as much progress, and this can be a leveraging tool to help them gain access. We think about reading and writing. So maybe some students with dyslexia are, doing really well and might not need much support, while others really struggle with the decoding and the comprehension. And similar with writing. Also, people that struggle with motor skills, maybe they need to use their computer at school or in work, but they don't have the fine motor abilities to use a regular keyboard. So you might think about an external keyboard or voice typing if they can. Similarly with attention and executive functioning. So this is a big area. I know there's a lot of overlap between executive functioning and learning challenges and dyslexia and ADHD and all the things. And sometimes people that struggle with executive functioning need like an outside tool to kind of assist them in being able to remember tasks and being able to plan long-term assignments. And so we think about like external supports. And I want to kind of deviate really quick that we talk about it as assistive technology, but it doesn't have to be technology. So it can be anywhere from low tech all the way up through high tech. And I wish we could coin it differently. Like I would say like assistive tools. That's a better like understanding of it. It doesn't have to be tech. It could be a graphic organizer as a form of assistive technology if that helps the like planning, organizing processes of writing, So so those are kind of like some examples. And like also interestingly, like we all benefit from people who've had disabilities from their accessibility. So for instance, like, I don't know, if we think about it like voice assistance or dictation, like that wasn't meant for everybody. that was really meant for people with mobility impairments. And we all use, many of us use Siri, Alexa, or just voice to text on our phone, right? But that wasn't meant for us yet. We're all benefiting from these things, or closed captioning. Like, I feel as if I need closed captioning on when I'm watching Netflix, or like if there's an accent or British show, I'm like, wait, I need the closed captioning. And it wasn't meant for me yet I benefit from it, English language learners benefit from English captioning. And something else that's fun is curb cuts. So like those are designed for wheelchair users, except parents with strollers benefit from curb cuts, traveling with luggage or delivery workers. So all the things that, we think about like that are really ubiquitous and for the masses started out as just for people with disabilities. So we all benefit from it.
I like that reframing of assistive tools.
Yeah,
that is a much better phrase. Are there certain indicators of when assistive technology may be appropriate?
Yeah, I think like some things to think about as families and teams and adults is if you're not seeing progress, maybe that might be a time where we're like, hey, is there something that we could consider? If we're talking about schools and, students that do have IEPs, it's and under special factors, every year IEP teams can consider like, hey, are there any like assistive tools that we haven't thought about that might help a student fill the gaps or make goals on IEP, an IEP area. So, I am an assistive technology specialist, but, the assistive technology team is really everybody. So, just having knowledge and understanding about it, like everybody can work together. Like you don't have to, and we can get to this, but like there's a lot of low tech free tools that we can, teams can easily try and see if that works and then update, special factors accordingly.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that ties well into the next question, kind of like looking at the IEP world. So how does AT support access to learning without replacing instruction? So I think this is a big thing that I hear in working with parents, right? Is the fear that some of these AT tools that are used as accommodations will replace intervention for developing the underlying skills. So for example, I hear this most frequently with writing, students who have graphomotor difficulties or, dysgraphia, a common and often very needed accommodation, right, is like we were talking about the speech to text or being able to type assignments as opposed to having to write everything out by hand. But then parents worry, well, will they develop the fine motor coordination needed to, develop their writing skills? So, not necessarily with that as an example, but how do you balance that for really IEP students in particular?
Yeah, no, I hear that a lot, Danielle, from families and teams. So 2 parts. So first, AT addresses the access barrier, not the learning goal. So it is like the bridge. So what bridge do we need to consider to get from A to B? Right? It's not the destination. It's it's like the vehicle which we're going to get to the destination. So we can like think about it in those terms. And I also think about this too. I actually just had a conversation with the school team about this. Let's just take the example of handwriting. So if handwriting is the task, like, and a student needs to they're working with their OT or their teacher on improving their fine motor coordination for writing. If that's the task, then that's the task and they should do that. If the task isn't handwriting itself, it is conveying your thoughts. It is demonstrating understanding. Then like we should also be opening the doors to other ways to do that. It doesn't have to be pen and paper unless the task is improving that, right? It's kind of like lifting weights. If we're lifting weights are great and they help build so many other, strengths and muscle groups in our body in order for us to function in the life in our world. But, just the weight itself, like that is, that should be, where am I going with this? Like that's the task, but we have to do that in order to improve everything else. And so if the goal isn't writing and improving fine motor, then we should also think about how else can that knowledge be demonstrated. And And also, if we're seeing students really frustrated with the task, I know writing can be a really frustrating component. And just from a speech and language perspective, it's the most demanding language task that we can do as humans. It involves everything. Like, as you know, it's like all the executive functioning, the fine motor, the language, the grammar, the spelling, the planning, the organizing, the revising. So if that is all creating, a frustrating time for a student, then like, let's think about how do we, bridge and bring more access to this. So maybe if a student can voice type their thoughts, initially, that might improve their frustration level. I think building access barriers, and it doesn't take away from instruction. It doesn't replace instruction.
So kind of also separating, it sounds like, the conceptual from the mechanical, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, let's not get stuck on it has to be pen and paper, pencil to paper. If we are moving into an even more digital world, and there's so many tools. And I think what's beautiful about assistive technology, and when you find a tool that works for a student, the students who've had years of struggling in schools, find, like, you see that glimmer of excitement in their eyes, and you're like, yeah, this tool can help. And they see that and they get excited. And then that's how you get buy-in too from the student. So I mean, we shouldn't be, belaboring the tool of writing with pencil and paper if the task isn't to improve fine motor at that point, in a classroom setting. Yeah.
Okay. I like that breakdown. So when we're thinking about the world of assessment, and I know that you do assessments that are school district facing and also IEEs, what are you looking for or putting together in your battery for a comprehensive AT assessment? Yeah.
Well, definitely. I think so. This is the framework that we use. That's best practice. And she since passed, but she was an amazing assistive technology specialist who's widely, regarded in our field. And her name is Dr. Joy Zabala. And she came up with a framework, and it's an acronym. It's called SETT, SETT. And SETT stands for, the S stands for setting, E stands for environment, T stands for tasks, and the last T stands for tools. So before we even do anything, because I think what happens is some people jump to tools, like, let's try this. This tool's for dyslexic. And we're like, no, we have to scale back. So S is for student. So what are the student's strengths? We really want to find out what are the areas, because we want to capitalize on that for areas of interest and for areas that they are struggling with. So what are students' strengths? What are their interests? What are their challenges? Are there any mobility challenges, vision challenges, language challenges, right? So we really want to know the student, and we can get that information definitely from families, from teams, from the IEP, observations with the student, right? And then E, let's move into like environment. And so that's really important, because I can't consider a tool unless we're talking about a certain environment and a task. So what is the setting? So if we're talking about a school setting, what setting is a student struggling with? Maybe they're struggling with math. Okay. What is the task in math? So it's going to be even more nuanced. It is the student, I'm just going to make this as an example. Conceptually, the student understands math concepts. When it comes to writing and lining up the numbers, his fine motor gets in the way and he comes up with the wrong answer. Not because he doesn't understand the equation, it's that fine motor piece. Okay, great. So now we know the student, now we know the environment, now we know the task. So now I can think about the tool. Well, maybe, and a tool's exploration too. It's not like, fast and furious. It's like, all right, let's explore. And I involve the student with it. I want them to rate how they like the tool. How does it feel? Do they feel like they can use it? So for this math example, having a worksheet, digital, might be helpful when they can align their numbers much better using technology. And then the handwriting is not a barrier to them being able to come up with the right answer because the numbers align in the computer. So that's a way. So we talk about student, environment, tasks, and tools. And tools is really the last thing. And I think a lot of people want to jump to tools first. But a tool is, and I don't even talk about tools as this, we have to get, a brand name tool, because in my experience, the tools will change, or the company goes out of business, or the companies merge. And so it's like, we have to talk about the features of the tool. So what about the tool is going to help the student? So we need voice typing. Okay, what are some tools that have voice typing? Well, what do you know? There's Google Docs has it for free, already built an accessibility feature. Great, and there's other different tools and Chrome extensions that have that too. So that's, I think, a really important piece of an assessment is really using that set framework, and you will get the details and the nuance and the exploration to determine what tools work. And then it also helps guide teams, because now we know when the tool needs to be used during what subject for what task.
So all those contextual details.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah. And then, other than that, I think if we're just doing assistive technology, like the reading, writing, executive functioning, oftentimes I'll use the DeCoste protocol, or the PARS assessment for reading. And so we just compare, how does the student read on their own? And then they answer comprehension questions. And then we're comparing that. Well, how does the student's comprehension improve if an adult reads it to them, grade level text? And then how do we compare that if a screen reader reads it to them? Or if they have the ability to have a built-in dictionary, highlight a word and define it for them that they didn't know, how does that aid in comprehension? And so your assistive technologies, and when I'm just doing that, it feels more like a compare and contrast. And it's kind of like a exploration of accommodations is what it is in that area.
Okay. Yeah, I like the way that also you're describing, you're looking at multiple different ways to kind of create that bridge, right? And then trying things to see what sticks. So are you doing that throughout the assessment process, or is that and that's the result of, the results that are recommended at the end of the assessment, or is that also part of the treatment through the IEP goals? Where does that kind of trial and error live?
Yeah. So, it usually starts with we're trying these during the assessment process, because we just want a good read on where can we start with. And these can always pivot. So every year, it's important to kind of address hey, do these tools still support the tasks and the IEP goals? Or, oftentimes if a student moves from elementary to middle, well, now it's a really different environment. There's a lot of different classrooms. Maybe where once they held on, their executive functionings did fine in 5th grade with one teacher, we were changing settings, and now it's a lot more demanding and there's a lot more to manage. And so I think it's important to just reassess as a team, every year, look at it, and look at the special factors and the accommodations. And it's just, hey, do we still feel like these meet their needs? And, just as I move through grades, the academics become more demanding and the language and reading becomes much more challenging. And so sometimes the gaps show up later. But it's important to reevaluate, I think, every year as a team. Then, does that answer?
It does. Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? Like you said, because not only is the tool that's most appropriate going to shift over time, but I love the analogy of a student may respond well to having somebody read something out loud, but not necessarily the digital voiceover. And so that's just a lot of nuance to kind of be always unpacking and exploring. So I appreciate that example. So I think kind of building on that, how do you introduce and support AT across environments to make sure that it is being used, and that adults also know how to use the tools and support the child in using the tools?
Yeah. So I'll talk about it in the assistive technology. So reading, writing, executive functioning, and then also talk about the AC, because it looks a little bit different. So when we're talking about, there's some overlap. So I think the first thing is introducing it in a structured, low stress setting. So I like the format I do, we do, you do. And sometimes you kind of have to gauge the individual. Like sometimes there's a lot of, I do, like myself, like Miss Anya. I do. And then I pause and then we do, and then if they're getting it, great. And then I move on to you do. But sometimes I get to we do and it's like, I'm not sure. And then we go back to so there is some flexibility and it really is student dependent, but usually that's kind of how I introduce tools. And I want to get buy-in. So I want to show the student like, hey, this is going to help leverage and make you be more independent in these areas. And who doesn't want to succeed? Even the struggling student with behavioral challenges, all of us are doing the best we can with the resources that we have. And I think students, especially ones that, have more behavioral challenges, they want the same. And so that's kind of the formula I use. And I like, sometimes it depends on the team. If the team has no idea how to use the tool and it's really foreign, then I sometimes, it's important to put together an assistive technology implementation plan. And then that can be really helpful for students. They can pin it in their Chromebook, or families. And then you could talk about, again, when we go to the set framework, like in this environment, in this task, you can use this tool. And so they just have that to reference because it's hard to remember all of it. Or maybe you want to roll out some things if we're talking about language literacy, AT stuff. Maybe you want to roll out what's going to be most impactful right away, because it's hard to be like, okay, you have this tool for this and this tool for this. It can be really overwhelming. So you could start incrementally and just like layer on. And then as far as AAC communication, so that there's some similarities, but it does look a little bit different. With this strategy, with this implementation, we use a really important strategy called modeling language on a communication system. So you can have the most amazing, fancy system, but if an individual doesn't know how to use it, obviously it's not going to be meaningful. And so an individual learns, or a child learns, through us modeling on it and attributing meaning. So it might be that I have the language system in front of me and I want to know what makes them smile and laugh. That's one of the questions that's important to find out when you're assessing. And so whatever they're interested in, let's say it's Rubik cubes, I'm going to model on the device, like, this is fun. Look at that. I like that. So I'm narrating from their perspective, from the student's perspective. And I think that that's really important to show them how they can think and teach them the language in an environment that is low stress. Because the minute, our stress goes up, our access to language centers goes down. And so this isn't about quizzing. Show me where color is, show me where purple is on your device. We're not quizzing at all. And we're never doing hand over hand. I'm modeling. And I promise you, over time, that's how an individual and a child can learn their system. And we definitely always want to program it with like personalizing it, if that means whatever, photos from family vacation, voice recordings from their favorite, TV show, just any way to get their interest and buy-in. And then always like team and family training is really important. And because this is about capacity building. And it's not an expert model. We want to move away from that and really train everybody so that it's sustainable, because providers change and things shift. And so if the family and the student and the team feel, well prepared and equipped, then, the device will grow with the child and it won't be abandoned.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you have research or familiar with any research about the effectiveness of AT for areas like reading, writing, math, attention? Like what does it show in the data in terms of how these systems can support kids' outcomes?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of data. I know the World Health Organization also discusses this, that that its effectiveness, and research consistently shows AT is most effective when it reduces barriers and supports independence and participation. And also, I think some areas that it supports is, we do need that training for students and adults. That's critical for AT to be successful. And really, I think the research shows that the fit between the tool, the task, and the learner matters the most than just the technology itself. So yeah, I think that, and then just like, the research does support this, and even there's research that shows having closed captioning on during, YouTube videos. Like I always tell teams and teachers that I work with, I'm like, that's the lowest hanging fruit. Just turn on closed captioning, and there's actually research that supports that improves the students' reading comprehension and reading skills, because they just need access to the written word, and so that's really easy to do. And just from a personal, not personal, but like just from experience, I've seen it do, wonders with students that have, struggled with school and certain tasks, and just to see them more independent and supported in school is super valuable. It really dictates the rest of their educational career. Yeah.
I love the example of the closed. I always have closed captioning on all the time because I need it now, but I've never thought about it in the context that, it's text being read aloud to you actually, which is, something that we're trying to always accommodate for our, kids with learning differences. But yeah, it's a whole system that it has the text being read, the lines of the movie, right, being read aloud to you with the contextual, scenes being acted out. So yeah, that makes sense that would be really good for reading comprehension. That's really cool. Yeah, I love that example. Yeah.
For that in. Yeah.
And I mean, this is a huge topic. I'm sure this could be a whole podcast of itself around AI, but maybe just briefly, I mean, AI is evolving rapidly. Is it influencing the AT landscape? And are there things that look promising, or are there things you're concerned about being like potentially misleading in this area?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think it is. There's an attorney that I listened to. They had a talk about AI in the educational system. And even they were saying, this is the wild, wild west. I mean, kind of, this is uncharted territory. Artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming the assistive technology landscape. And it does make tools more responsive and personalized and intuitive. But at the same time, we need to pause because it is evolving faster than policy and research, and educational systems are trying to keep up with this. And yeah, like I'll talk about like what looks promising, or what is promising from my experience is like the real-time language support. So like that text or grammar support, even like in our emails, it's like, are you wanting to say this? Like, yes, I am.
Yeah.
Or even like summarizing, text and things like that. Like that could be promising. Improved speech recognition. So oftentimes there's students that maybe have like some articulation challenges, and then the voice or the microphone isn't necessarily picking up all of the like speech disorder, because the sounds sound different, and so it's coming out on the screen different, and that can be a source of frustration. But with the improved speech recognition, the speech to text users can find that easier. There's definitely software that can do that, pick up those users. And then dynamic AAC systems. So this would be amazing, actually, if we had more AI in AAC, because it can be very labor intensive. But it is now learning more like vocabulary patterns. And then automated captioning and transcription. Like even we notice like in Zoom, it's like, oh my gosh, everything's transcribed now, that's AI. And I think where caution is needed is an over-reliance on it. So sometimes if we're too reliant on this, it can bypass skill development. And I think that's where a lot of educators and families and administrators might be giving pause. That it's like just bypassing everything and not pairing it ready for instruction. Sometimes there's equity concerns, like some districts might have access to something that others don't. And definitely a big one would be like privacy and data security issues. And I just want to emphasize that I think like each school district is handling this differently. So, always talk to your school district or about their policy and privacy. You might find like some school districts, especially if it's just like high school districts, might be, exploring these a little bit differently. Maybe they're using one tool, but not other tools. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely pros and cons, and I think we'll definitely find out more in the coming year, next few years. But I do know, I will, in a college setting, it's much different than K-12. So in community colleges and even in state and UC, many of them, and we used AI for taking notes as a note taker. There's something called Otter AI, and students loved it. And it would just transcribe everything that was said and audio recorded. And then the student had the lecture. And so that's an accommodation, but that's not for K-12, and that, because of privacy and everything. So that would be great if you're moving on to college setting. So yeah, it's just depends on the setting too.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen in our practice with the large scale language models, a lot of promise with kids who have more significant cognitive impairments, for example, that may not be able to previously draft an email by themselves, for example, but with, more minimal levels of scaffolding, they're able to write an email. And so it's, I think, really doing some cool things for self-advocacy. And from what I've seen in those limited examples, what comes... And I'm wondering if this is, you've seen this, but in psychology, one of the areas is there's just not a lot of research, right, that supports the effectiveness of the tools. Like you said, the privacy, if they're actually doing what they're saying they're doing. In psychology, I think the biggest parallel too is people using chatbots as therapists, but it's therapists have obviously a credentialing process, and, the chatbots aren't going through anything like that, right? There's no FDA cleared mental health AI, mental health provider. I would assume it's the same in the AT world. Yes, I'm always just curious.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There's a lot of misinformation. It's not always going to be helpful. I think there is some benefits, but yeah, just we need to proceed with caution, and especially for privacy and skill building, because that's essentially what we want.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and with the AI stuff too, I mean, I know you work in higher education, and there's concern about people, again, not actually learning the conceptual skills. That's going back to what we were saying earlier, right? You want AT to be the bridge between kind of the mechanics and the conceptual piece, ideally. But if it's doing all the conceptual work and the mechanical work, then it gets tricky for everybody, not just people who need AT or with disabilities. But yeah, like I said, I'm sure it's a super interesting topic in and of itself.
And it's going to probably sound different in 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of barriers, what do you typically see come up that's affecting access or implementation? So it's issues with training, capacity, funding. So what's getting in the way, and what do you typically see as ways to circumvent those issues?
Yeah. So yeah, there can be a lot of barriers. In this, I think, time period, there's been a lot of high staff turnovers. And so if we're constantly, there's, especially in special education, there's, depending on which district or which area, there's a higher staff turnover than others. So that can disrupt, skill building for the team. I think also funding comes into play. Sometimes and it's a real challenge. I understand funding, the districts maybe don't, depending on what district, maybe they really don't have funding to train classroom aides, because that would be extra pay outside of their time. Right. And so that's a real challenge. And especially with funding being removed these days, sometimes I see buy-in being a challenge or a barrier. So it can be maybe there's the staff doesn't have buy-in. And I'll circle back to that. Maybe there's family doesn't have buy-in, or there's student buy-in. And I think buy-in is a real big, can be a really big barrier. So oftentimes I hear, oh, they don't need to use this. If we're talking about AAC, they can talk. They don't need this. And so it's modeled in the classroom because adults have the mindset that they don't need it. So why take it out of the backpack? Why have it out? Yeah. And so if there's the staff isn't bought in, then there's the implementation falls. And so I see that being a real big barrier. And then, yeah, like sometimes, caseloads are really high and teams really want to know and learn, but there's just ever increasing demands of, paperwork and all the different things that are put on teachers' plates. Sometimes that can be a barrier, or like approval processes can be slow. Equipment ordering is slow or backed up. Repairs and replacement. I think a big one is like misconceptions about AT. I think, and I do talk about this a lot, is just sometimes it's the adult mindset that's the hardest part. That can stall access to the tool that the individual needs,
And aside from, I know you mentioned like, for like an example of, the student can communicate without this, they don't need that. Like, what are the other misconceptions you see from adults?
That it is a crutch, that it will prohibit their skill building. Those are the other things that I hear a lot, or we don't have time to use this. But yeah, I see a lot of times that it's a crutch, and maybe I think we touched on this in the beginning, where maybe, a family's like, or a team thinks, well, if they're using this and they're not going to learn how to do X, Y, Z. And then we have to go back to, no, this is about access. Right. So, and this is a good example. And I go to reading because I know there's so many students that struggle with reading and keeping up with reading. And so like, as this, but for those that, there's kind of, I think about like 2 layers of reading. It's like the decoding of it. And then there's like, when you get really good at that, then the language piece, the comprehension, but you have to be so good at the decoding that it's ease. And then your brain is focused on the language comprehension piece. But if we have a student, and as they move and the gap gets bigger, and we're talking about a 6th grader who's still decoding and has goals, IEP goals, maybe at a 1st grade level or a 2nd grade level. And how are they going to access their history book if they can't decode it? So now, so that's where we're talking about access. They can still work on their IEP goals of bell teams and diet graphs and putting together multisyllabic words. In addition to, but the student needs access to Bookshare to access their science book or history book. And so that's when you're thinking about, that's the bridge. They need to be able to act, because otherwise they're only beholden to what they can decode. And that doesn't build confidence. And that's not someone excited to jump up in the morning and go to school, where they know that is across their day, they're faced with the one thing that they're struggling with most. You can we can empathize with that. But allowing them to have access to things that are inaccessible at this time, maybe not forever. But I think that can, teaching teams about, the misconception around AT, sometimes that could be a barrier.
Okay. Those are really helpful examples. Great. So I think to wrap up, are there any examples you want to share about how AT can support students with reading or writing or with language or communication, like any stories or, big takeaways that you think are helpful for parents to hear about?
Yeah, I think a few things, like thinking about what are the features of a tool that might be helpful, knowing what the task is and maybe some features of the tool, knowing that tools will change. They might not always be the same. They might not always need the tools. So just like considering it every year. And I think something big too is I know like when we're talking about special education, to get anything, you have to do an assessment. And maybe that is warranted, but even before that, there's so many free resources that and that are tier one. When we're talking about the MTSS model, the multi-tiered systems of support. Tier one is like what's available to everybody. So screen readers are available to everybody. Those are built-in accessibility features. If a student has struggles with executive functioning, there's Google Keep. That's built into the Google products. And I use that both professionally and personally. And that has digital sticky notes, so they'll never lose their notes. There's a lot of like free, low stakes tools that can be considered. And I'm also happy I made a resource, like an interactive slide deck, and I'm happy to share that with families. And that's a great place because you can talk about it. It has it where it's laid out, like if a student struggles with executive functioning, you would touch on that. And then I have at least like 3 to 5 different free tools. And I say, like, just like try it out. You don't necessarily need an AT specialist to be trying it out with your child or young adult or adolescent or student. You can try these with them and see, hey, does this work? And that's great information for the team. And then having the team consider that tool would be great. So I don't want families or anybody to feel like, oh, I can't do this. There's no harm in trying, right? And so I think those are important to think about. And like, especially with, I think like, AAC, I think it can feel, like gatekeeping because you do need an assessment to get, because those cost money. When things cost money, and usually in the school districts, unless they do have things available for everybody, usually that does go through an assessment for funding, right? But there's so many amazing, like, light tech core boards, or there's several robust, no cost, symbol-based communication apps available. And I think that those can reduce financial barriers for families because they can be very costly to buy an iPad, and to buy the app is usually $200 to $400. But yeah, for example, there's an app called Weave Chat, and what's great is it's completely free. So like, there's no harm in just trying it and seeing like, hey, does my child respond to this? And exploring that. But, you don't have to wait. I mean, you obviously can wait for, a speech and language pathologist, but it's also helpful to share that if you are working with a speech and language pathologist, like, hey, we've been trying this at home, and, responsive, or hey, they're listening more when I'm touching the icon, or hey, they started exploring it with themselves. Like, that's all really helpful information because, we're all part of the same team. So again, Weave Chat is completely free and it's available, and I have no affiliation with them, but I just think it's wonderful that it's free. And so I've been sharing this with teams and families too. There's a district that uses it for everybody, for extensive support needs classrooms. It's just like available. And that's for iOS and Android. So no matter what, I think we all have smartphones now. So whichever smartphone you have, you can try it. But that said, no app replaces like individualized assessments and supports. But it's okay to like try it. That's what I want to encourage families. Like, it's okay to try it and see how it fits and see how your child responds. And I think that's what we call like universal design. It's like, it's available for everybody. And so we can start there and see what works.
Well, I'm excited to check out the slide deck too. And I love the idea of piloting things. It's very educational therapy too, and like, how does your kid learn, and then putting in tools to help them learn better, basically, right, with their profile. So I'm excited to check out those resources too.
Yeah, there's no harm.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Anya. This has been super enlightening, and I know our audience will appreciate all your expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great conversation. Thanks.
Okay, and we'll include all your information in the show notes. But if parents are interested in doing assessment work, can you talk a little bit about like how to reach you, or kind of like what you're available for in terms of consultation or testing or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I'm available by email. I do have parents want to email me at anya.ashouri.slp.com. And I do have a landing page that I'm happy to share with resources for teams. So I will provide those and the slide deck, and we can share that with families.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for your time today.
No. All right. Bye-bye.